October 14, 1943. The air above Schweinfurt, Germany, trembles with the roar of 400 Wright Cyclone engines. Major Egon Mayer sits in the cramped cockpit of his Messerschmitt Bf 109G6, leather gloves gripping the control column, eyes scanning the horizon through scratched plexiglass. The autumn sun breaks through scattered clouds at 26,000 feet, casting long shadows across the Bavarian countryside below. He has flown this same patrol route 67 times. He knows every church spire, every river bend, every farm that dots the landscape like pieces on a chessboard. But today, something is different. Today, the sky itself seems darker, heavier, filled with a sound that makes his chest tighten, not from fear, but from a creeping realization he cannot yet name. The radio crackles. His wingman's voice cuts through the static. Herr Major, amerikanische bomber. Hundreds of them. Mayer pulls back on the stick, climbing toward the approaching formation. And then he sees them. Not dozens, not scores, but a metallic river stretching from horizon to horizon. Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses in combat boxes, so vast they seem to blot out the sun itself. Each fortress bristles with 1350 caliber machine guns. Each one carries 5,000 pounds of high explosive. And there are so many that Mayer, who has shot down 98 enemy aircraft, who wears the Knight's Cross at his throat, who has never questioned the Führer's promise of final victory, feels something he has not felt since 1940. Doubt. The Luftwaffe had entered the war as the most formidable air force on Earth. In September 1939, when German tanks rolled into Poland, Messerschmitt fighters and Junkers dive bombers had ruled the skies with mechanical precision. They had shattered the Polish Air Force in 3 days. They had swept the French from the heavens in 6 weeks. During the Battle of Britain, though the RAF had fought them to a standstill, German pilots had still believed, truly believed, that they flew the finest aircraft in the world, guided by the most advanced tactical doctrine, supported by the industrial might of a nation forged for total war. Men like Egon Mayer and Adolf Galland and Werner Mulders had become legends, their kill counts climbing into double digits, then triple digits, their names spoken with reverence in briefing rooms and beer halls alike. They had trained for years in secret Luftwaffe schools, honing their craft until flying became instinct, until their aircraft felt like extensions of their own bodies. They were the elite, the chosen, the masters of the air. And they had been told repeatedly by Joseph Goebbels and Hermann Göring and every propaganda film that flickered across German cinema screens that American industry was a paper tiger, that the United States was a nation of gangsters and jazz musicians and soft, luxury-addicted civilians who could never match German engineering, German discipline, German will. But now, in October 1943, as Egon Mayer pushes his throttle forward and commits to an attack run against a formation of B-17s so large it takes 30 seconds to fly past at 300 miles per hour, he understands that something fundamental has changed. The intelligence reports he dismissed as exaggeration, the numbers that had seemed too absurd to be real, the whispered rumors that had circulated through the officers' mess, they were all true. America was not sending dozens of bombers. They were sending hundreds. And when German flak and fighters shot them down, when they burned and broke apart and spiraled into the German countryside trailing smoke and fragments of aluminum, more appeared the next day. And the day after that. An endless silver tide that never diminished, never faltered, never stopped coming. The Americans were replacing their losses faster than the Luftwaffe could inflict them. It was mathematically impossible. It defied every principle of industrial warfare that German military planners had studied. And yet, here was the proof, thundering through the stratosphere in formations so dense that their contrails wove a white lattice across the blue October sky. The reality was even more staggering than Mayer could have imagined. In January 1940, the United States had produced 168 military aircraft. The German aviation industry, meanwhile, had built over 1,000 fighters and bombers that same month. The Luftwaffe's technical superiority seemed unassailable. But Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in his State of the Union address that January, had called for the production of 50,000 aircraft per year. 50,000. The number had been so preposterous that German intelligence analysts had laughed. The German press had mocked it as American bravado, the delusional boasting of a democracy too weak and divided to wage modern war. Even American industrialists had considered it impossible. William Knudsen, the Danish immigrant who ran General Motors and whom Roosevelt would appoint to oversee defense production, had initially thought the president mad. But Roosevelt had not been speaking metaphorically. He had meant it literally. and he had surrounded himself with men who believed that American capitalism, properly mobilized, could accomplish miracles that no totalitarian state could match. By December 1941, when Japanese bombs fell on Pearl Harbor and Hitler declared war on America, the transformation had already begun. Automobile factories in Detroit were retooling their assembly lines. Aircraft companies were hiring tens of thousands of workers, men and women, black and white, immigrants and native-born, and training them to rivet aluminum and wire electrical systems and install engines with a speed that would have seemed impossible in peacetime. The Ford Willow Run plant, a single facility covering 67 acres near Detroit, was designed from the ground up to mass-produce B-24 Liberator heavy bombers using the same techniques Henry Ford had pioneered for the Model T. The building was so large that it had its own weather system. On humid days, clouds formed near the ceiling. At peak production, Willow Run would complete one B-24 every 63 minutes. One complete four-engine bomber, weighing 32 tons and containing hundreds of thousands of individual parts, rolling off the line every single hour. It was not craftsmanship in the European sense. German aviation workers were trained artisans who hand-fitted components with micrometer precision. It was something entirely different. It was industrial mass production applied to warfare with a ruthlessness and efficiency that redefined what was possible. By 1943, American factories were producing more than 7,000 aircraft per month. Not fighters alone, not trainers alone, but combat aircraft, B-17 Flying Fortresses, B-24 Liberators, P-47 Thunderbolts, P-51 Mustangs, C-47 Skitran transports, and dozens of other types, flowing from assembly lines in California and Texas and Kansas and New York in a torrent of aluminum and steel. In March 1944, production peaked at over 9,000 aircraft in a single month. By the end of the war, American industry would deliver nearly 300,000 military aircraft, more than Germany, Japan, Britain, and the Soviet Union combined. And these were not crude, hastily built machines. They were sophisticated, well-armed, long-range aircraft, incorporating technologies like turbo-superchargers and self-sealing fuel tanks and centralized fire control systems. Each B-17 required 36,000 separate parts. Each P-51 Mustang needed its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine built under license by Packard Motor Company, its airframe assembled from thousands of stamped aluminum components, its 650 caliber machine guns manufactured and synchronized to fire through the propeller arc without blowing the blades off. And America was building them faster than Germany could shoot them down. Nazi ideology had fatally miscalculated American potential. The propaganda that portrayed the United States as weak, divided, corrupted by racial mixing and democracy had blinded German leadership to the reality that democracy could be a source of strength. That diversity could drive innovation. That free labor was more productive than slave labor. That a worker who owned stock in Boeing or Ford or Douglas had a personal stake in production that no beaten concentration camp prisoner could ever match. American factory workers bought war bonds with their wages. They volunteered for extra shifts. They understood, in a way that was foreign to fascist thinking, that they were fighting for something worth preserving, not racial purity or Lebensraum or the glory of conquest, but the right to live freely, to speak openly, to build a life without bowing to tyrants. And that collective will, multiplied across millions of workers and billions of dollars of investment, had translated into the 10,000 aircraft per month that haunted Egon Mayer's final missions. The silver bombers continued to fill German skies until the last day of the war. On May 7, 1945, as German representatives signed unconditional surrender documents at Reims, France, American B-17s and B-24s were still airborne over Germany, still dropping bombs on targets that no longer mattered, maintained in the air by an industrial momentum so great that it took days to fully halt. The factories in Detroit and Long Beach and Fort Worth did not stop production immediately when Germany surrendered. P-51s and B-17s continued rolling off assembly lines into June, contracts slowly winding down, workers gradually transitioning back to civilian production. America had built so many aircraft that thousands would never see combat, parked in desert storage facilities or scrapped immediately after the war, victims of overproduction. The surplus was so vast that complete, combat-ready B-17s were sold for scrap metal at $500 each, less than the cost of the instruments in the cockpit. There is no single object that better represents this overwhelming abundance than the simple aluminum bomber, 74,000 pounds of stress metal skin wrapped around 4 Cyclone engines, each one a masterpiece of precision engineering, mass-produced at a rate that would have seemed miraculous just 5 years earlier. Each B-17 carried in its riveted frame the labor of thousands, the miners who extracted bauxite from Arkansas, the smelter workers who refined it into aluminum, the factory workers who stamped and formed the sheets, the riveters who assembled the fuselage, the electricians who wired the complex systems, the painters who applied the drab olive camouflage, the ferry pilots who delivered the completed aircraft to England. Each bomber represented hundreds of hours of skilled and unskilled labor, coordinated across a supply chain spanning an entire continent. And America built them by the thousands, stacked them in neat rows at English airfields, flew them into German flak until they burned and fell, and then built more to replace them. The B-17 was not just an aircraft, it was proof made manifest, metal rendered into argument, a flying refutation of everything the Nazis believed about American weakness. In the end, the Luftwaffe pilots who survived came to a realization that their propaganda had worked desperately to suppress. They had been fighting not just American pilots, but American industry. And American industry was a force of nature, as inexorable as weather, as inevitable as gravity. You could shoot down individual aircraft, kill individual crews, celebrate individual victories. But you could not stop the factories. You could not bomb the assembly lines in Detroit and California and Kansas because they were 3,000 miles away, protected by oceans and an air force that controlled its own skies absolutely. You could only watch as the formations grew larger, the escorts more numerous, the bombing more devastating, day after day, month after month, until the Luftwaffe itself was grounded for lack of fuel, its pilots killed or captured, its aircraft destroyed on the ground because there was no gasoline to fly them. The 10,000 aircraft per month, a number that started as Roosevelt's impossible dream and ended as documented reality, represented more than American industrial might. They represented a different vision of human potential, one where prosperity and power were not zero-sum, where abundance could be created rather than merely seized, where the arc of progress bent toward freedom because free people, given the tools and opportunity, could build wonders that tyrants could never match. The Messerschmitt pilots who looked up at those endless silver formations saw their own defeat written in contrails across the sky. But they were seeing something larger, something that would reshape the post-war world, proof that democracy, for all its messy inefficiency, all its arguments and compromises and seemingly wasteful debates, could mobilize resources and human will on scales that no dictatorship could match. The assembly lines that built B-17s and P-51s would, after the war, build suburbs and automobiles and commercial jetliners. The workers who riveted bombers would become the middle class that defined the American century. The production techniques that made 10,000 aircraft per month possible would drive prosperity that spread across the world. Egon Mayer died without understanding this. He died believing he was fighting for Germany's survival, for the defense of Europe, for ideals that propaganda had convinced him were noble. He could not see that the silver bombers represented not just military power, but an entirely different future, one where the capacity to create mattered more than the will to conquer, where engineering and logistics trumped racial mythology, where the nation that built more would ultimately determine what kind of world emerged from the ashes of war. The 10,000 aircraft per month were not just weapons. They were a verdict. They were history's judgment, rendered in aluminum and high explosive. They were the sound of the future drowning out the past, the roar of 400 Wright Cyclone engines announcing that the age of fascism was ending, brought down not primarily by courage or ideology, but by something more fundamental. The simple, undeniable, mathematically certain reality that democracy, given time to mobilize, could outproduce, outbuild, and outlast any tyranny on Earth. The sky was full of proof. And the proof kept coming, from dawn until dusk, every single day, until there was no German sky left to fill.